The passports lay on the hall table, a small stack of dark blue booklets bound with a rubber band. 4 of them: David's, Sarah's, young Leo's, and Lily's. Mine was not among them. I had placed it there myself the night before, at the top of the pile, a silent offering. Now it was gone from the stack, set aside, placed near the bowl of spare keys, as if it were just another household object, inert and without purpose. A small, almost imperceptible thing. But I noticed. Of course I noticed. I had spent the better part of my 73 years noticing the small things others overlooked. It was a skill one developed when one's own presence had become a small thing. My son, David, had delivered the news with the practiced ease of someone announcing a change in grocery lists. He had his mother's way of making pronouncements sound like foregone conclusions, as if the universe had already signed off on the decision and he was merely the messenger. He stood in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, not looking at me. They had been planning this trip to Portugal for months. My trip. It had been my suggestion, born from a documentary I'd watched about the old trams in Lisbon, a flicker of a forgotten desire to see something new. I'd offered to pay for everyone. It was what I did. I was the bank, the quiet benefactor, the sturdy, reliable oak in the corner of the garden that provided shade and asked for nothing in return. Dad, he'd started, the word a preamble to a dismissal. We've been talking, Sarah and I. And we just think, well, a 10-hour flight, all that walking on cobblestones, it's a lot. At your age, he glanced up, a quick, assessing look, as if checking for cracks in a piece of old furniture. We'd just be worried about you the whole time. It would be better, easier for everyone, if you stayed. Watch the house. Keep things in order. I remember the silence that followed. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of a lawnmower from a neighbor's yard. I had simply nodded. What else was there to do? To argue would be to seem frail. To protest would be to become a burden, the very thing he was accusing me of being. I had learned long ago that the path of least resistance was a quiet one. It was a path paved with nods and small, agreeable smiles. It led to a place of profound invisibility, but it was, for the most part, peaceful. So I nodded, and the conversation was over. He had already moved on, showing me a picture of a sea base on his phone that a colleague had caught. Now, in the quiet of the morning, the house was a tomb of their preparations. Suitcases stood half-packed in the hallway like patient hounds. The air smelled of sunscreen and the specific, cloying scent of Sarah's travel-sized hairspray. The passports on the table were the final piece of evidence. I picked up my own. It felt cool and foreign in my hand, a document attesting to a man who could, in theory, cross borders. I flipped it open. The photograph was 10 years old. The man in it had fewer lines around his eyes, but his expression was the same, a look of faint surprise, as if he'd been caught in a place he wasn't meant to be. I ran my thumb over the blank pages, a barren landscape of unstamped potential. This would soon be filled with the ink of Portuguese officialdom. Mine would remain pristine, unwanted. A tremor started in my right hand, a familiar companion in moments of unvoiced distress. It was not a violent shaking, but a fine, humming vibration, as if a small, trapped bird were beating its wings against my bones. I set the passport down and walked into the kitchen, my feet silent on the worn linoleum. The cure for the tremor, for the knot tightening in my chest, was ritual. It was always ritual. I took out the coffee beans, the grinder, the French press. Each action was deliberate, a small, controllable piece of a world that had slipped its moorings. The whir of the grinder was a satisfying roar that filled the silence. The scent of the freshly ground beans, dark, earthy, full of bitter promise, was an anchor. I poured the hot water over the grounds, watching them bloom and swirl, a miniature, chaotic universe I had set into motion. As the coffee steeped, I leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the garden. My garden. The roses were in full rebellion, a riot of crimson and pale pink against the weathered fence. I had planted them the year Martha died. They were the one thing that was entirely mine, a space where my tending and patience yielded something beautiful and alive, something that did not talk back or make assumptions about my capabilities. For 20 years, I had been a father. For the last 10, a widower. For the last 5, a grandfather. Each role had sanded me down, smoothing away the edges of the man I had been before. A man who loved Chet Baker and old maps. A man who had once, on a whim, driven to New Orleans just to hear a specific saxophone player. Where had that man gone? He hadn't died. He had simply been put away, like a good suit saved for an occasion that never came. The family's logic was on its surface sound. It was the logic of care, of concern. But beneath, it was the chilling hum of convenience. My presence was an unknown variable, a potential complication in their seamless itinerary of beaches and restaurants. My absence was a known quantity. The house would be safe, the cat fed, the mail collected. I had been relegated from participant to groundskeeper. The tremor in my hand subsided as a different feeling began to take its place. It was not anger, not yet. It was something colder, clearer, a kind of quiet fury that didn't need to shout. It was the feeling of a lock clicking into place. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one Lily had made for me in a pottery class, its handle slightly askew. The dark liquid was a balm. I drank it black, the bitterness a welcome shock to the system. I thought about a lifetime of being muted, of being obedient. I had done it for Martha, because it made her life easier. I had done it for David, because he was my son and his happiness felt like a reflection of my own. I had become the reliable, predictable, stable force in their lives. The foundation. But no one ever asks the foundation if it wants to see the sky. It is built on top of it. I finished the coffee and rinsed the mug, placing it carefully in the dish drainer. The house was still. They were all still asleep, dreaming of Lisbon, of sunshine and grilled fish. They would wake in a few hours, and the whirlwind of departure would begin. There would be frantic searches for phone chargers, arguments over packing space, a final, patronizing list of instructions for me, left on the kitchen counter. Water the ferns on Wednesday, Dad. Don't forget recycling is on Thursday. Call if you need anything. The words were already written in my mind. I walked back into the hall and looked at the pile of passports. David's, Sarah's, Leo's, Lily's. Then I walked into my small study, the room that was more of a repository for old bills and forgotten books than a place of work. I sat down at the heavy oak desk, the one that had been my father's, and switched on the computer. The machine hummed to life, its gentle fan a whisper in the silent house. I opened a web browser. The airline's logo appeared, a stylized bird in flight. I typed in the booking reference number, which I had memorized from the confirmation email David had forwarded to me weeks ago, under the subject line for your info, not for your input, just for your information. I entered David's last name. The reservation appeared on the screen. For passengers, Lisbon, return. My finger hovered over the Manage Booking button. The tremor returned, not from distress this time, but from a surge of something that felt dangerously like power. I clicked the button. A menu of options appeared. Change seats. Add baggage. Cancel flight. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. I moved the cursor down, slowly, deliberately, until it rested on the 2 words that felt like a declaration of independence. I clicked. Are you sure you want to cancel this booking? All tickets will be forfeited. A small, red warning box. A final chance to retreat to the quiet, predictable path. I thought of my passport, alone by the key bowl. I thought of the phrase, at your age. I thought of the unstamped pages. I took a deep, steadying breath and clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. Your booking has been successfully canceled. It was done. A quiet, digital execution. There was no explosion, no grand pronouncement. Just a few lines of text on a screen in a silent house. But the world had shifted. The foundation had just developed a crack, and through it, I could finally see a sliver of the sky. After the cancellation, a profound calm settled over me. The act itself, so simple and yet so monumental, had drained the fury and left behind a clean, clear space. I sat at the desk for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the single beam of sunlight slanting through the window. For the first time in what felt like a decade, no one was depending on me for anything. My pension was my own. My time was my own. My passport, sitting on the hall table, was a book of blank pages waiting for a story. I made a mental inventory. My health was good, despite my family's sudden, convenient concerns. I walked 2 miles every day. My doctor had pronounced me, with a hint of surprise, remarkably well-preserved. I had a valid passport. I had savings, carefully accumulated over a lifetime of prudent living, money that was usually siphoned off for down payments on cars or emergency tuition fees. But not today. Today it was just mine. There was nothing and no one to hold me back. The idea came to me not as a shout, but as a whisper. If they were going to Lisbon, then so was I. But not with them. Not as their liability, their afterthought. I would go on my own terms. The thought was so audacious, so contrary to the man I had become, that I almost laughed. Me, on a solo trip to a foreign country? The man who needed his granddaughter to set up his television? But the whisper persisted, growing into a low, insistent hum. Why not? I turned back to the computer. The airline's homepage was still open. I typed Lisbon into the destination field. I selected one adult. The words looked stark and beautiful on the screen. One adult. I chose a flight leaving that very evening. A red-eye. It felt appropriate. A journey undertaken under the cover of darkness, a quiet escape. I entered my own name, my own details. I paid with my own credit card, the one I kept for emergencies. This felt like one. A spiritual emergency. The confirmation email arrived a moment later. Henry Turner. Confirmed. It was a name I hadn't seen standing on its own for a very long time. It was usually David's dad, or Grandpa Henry, just Henry Turner. It felt good. Now I had a purpose. A secret. I went upstairs to my bedroom, moving with a newfound lightness. The house was still asleep, a slumbering beast unaware of the shift in its ecosystem. I opened my wardrobe. It was a sea of beige, gray, and sensible navy blue. The uniform of a man who did not wish to be noticed. But in the very back, behind a row of checkered shirts, was a garment bag. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside, my good suit was hanging, a dark charcoal wool that Martha had insisted I buy for a wedding we'd attended. It still smelled faintly of her perfume and cedar. I laid it on the bed. Beside it, I placed a crisp white shirt. And then, from a small wooden box in my dresser drawer, I took out my ties. I chose a silk one, a deep burgundy with a subtle silver pattern. It was a tie for a man who had somewhere important to be. Packing was a symbolic act, an unearthing of a forgotten self. I didn't pack the sensible walking shoes David had bought me for Christmas, the ones with thick orthopedic soles. I packed the leather brogues I hadn't worn since my retirement party. I packed a small, leather-bound notebook and a good fountain pen, objects from time when I believed my thoughts were worth recording. I packed the silver watch Martha had given me for our 25th anniversary. Its battery had been dead for years. I made a mental note to get it replaced at the airport. It felt important to know my time again. My suitcase was small, a carry-on. I was not taking much with me, only the essential pieces of a man I was hoping to reacquaint myself with. By the time I heard the first stirrings from downstairs, my bag was packed and hidden in the study. I went down to the kitchen and put on another pot of coffee, playing the part they expected of me. Sarah was the first one down, her face a mask of pre-travel stress. "Morning, Henry," she said, not looking at me as she rummaged in the cupboard for a cereal bar. "Did you sleep well?" The question was a courtesy, an empty vessel. I told her I had, which was not entirely a lie. I hadn't slept, but I had rested in a way I hadn't for years. David came down next, followed by the children, and the house erupted into the controlled chaos of their departure. I moved through it like a ghost, an observer. I made toast for Leo. I found Lily's lost hairbrush. I listened as David ran through the list of instructions, his voice full of the easy authority of a man in charge. I nodded and said, "Of course," and "I will," and "Don't you worry." Each word was a performance. Inside, I was a coiled spring. I was a secret agent in my own home. The taxi was due at 10. At 9:30, David, phone in hand, suddenly went still. "That's weird," he muttered, staring at the screen. Sarah looked over his shoulder. "What is?" His face was a canvas of confusion. "The airline. They sent an email. It says our flight was canceled." A beautiful, perfect silence descended on the kitchen. It was broken by Sarah. What do you mean, canceled? How can it be canceled? David was tapping furiously at his phone. I don't know. It just says canceled. By customer request. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an explanation in the very air. He looked at Sarah, at the kids, and then, finally, at me. His gaze held no suspicion, only a kind of blank incomprehension. I was so far outside his realm of possibility that I might as well have been a piece of furniture. I met his eyes and raised my eyebrows in a pantomime of shared confusion. That's terrible, I said, and my voice was impressively steady. You should call them. The next hour was a masterclass in domestic panic. There was shouting, frantic phone calls, the sound of a customer service hold music tinning from David's phone. I just sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, an island of calm in their storm. They would not get on a flight to Lisbon today. They would not get one tomorrow. The summer holidays were in full swing. Every seat was booked. Their trip had evaporated. When the taxi arrived, I helped the driver load their useless suitcases back into the house. The defeat in David's posture was profound. Sarah was on the verge of tears. Leo was complaining loudly about his missed vacation. Only Lily was quiet, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. As I passed her in the hallway, she touched my arm. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice low. I looked at her, this girl on the cusp of womanhood, the one who had always possessed a strange, quiet perceptiveness. "I'm fine, Lily," I said, and I smiled. A real smile. "Everything is just fine." They spent the rest of the day in a state of mourning, slumped on the sofa, scrolling through their phones for miracle flights that didn't exist. I retreated to my garden. I deadhead the roses. I weeded the petunias. I felt the sun on my back. At 5 o'clock, I went inside. I told them I was going out for a walk, that I needed some air. No one looked up. I went into the study, picked up my small suitcase, and walked out the back door. I did not go for a walk. I walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. The bus arrived, and, as it pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself one last look at the house. My house. But I wasn't looking at the building. I was looking back at a life, a role I had played for so long, I had forgotten it was a costume. I didn't look back again. The airport was a shock to the system, a cacophony of languages and hurried footsteps, a river of humanity flowing in a dozen different directions. For a moment, standing in the vast departures hall, I felt a tremor of doubt. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. But then I saw a sign for a watch repair shop. It felt like a small, manageable task, an anchor in the chaos. The man behind the counter was young, with kind eyes. He replaced the battery in Martha's watch with deft, precise movements. When he handed it back, I strapped it to my wrist. The tiny, almost imperceptible tick-tick-tick against my skin was a profound comfort. It was the sound of my own time starting again. Stepping off the plane in Lisbon was like walking into a warm, damp towel. The air, thick with the scent of salt and jet fuel, clung to my skin. It was the middle of the night, but the city was alive, a sprawling constellation of golden lights against the deep velvet of the sky. I had booked a room in a small hotel in the Alfama district, a place the internet had described as authentic. The taxi ride was a blur of winding, narrow streets, the car's headlights flashing across ancient, tiled facades and dark, mysterious alleyways. The driver spoke a rapid, musical Portuguese, pointing out landmarks I couldn't see, and I just nodded, a passenger in a story that was just beginning. My room was small and simple, with a narrow iron balcony overlooking a tiny square. I opened the doors and stepped out. The night was not silent. From somewhere below, the faint, melancholy notes of a guitar drifted up, a sad, beautiful sound that seemed to seep into the very stones of the city. Fado. I had read about it. The sound was a perfect match for the feeling in my chest, a deep, resonant sadness, but a sadness that was not without beauty. It was the grief of a lifetime of being unwanted, of being set aside. Here, alone on a balcony in a foreign city, I didn't have to hide it. I didn't have to perform contentedness for anyone. I could just let it be. There were no tears. My grief was a quieter, drier thing. It was a stillness, a recognition of a truth I had spent years avoiding. I stood there for a long time, listening to the music fade, until the only sound was the ticking of the watch on my wrist. The next morning, I woke to the sound of church bells and the clatter of the city coming to life. I did not have a plan. For decades, my days have been structured by the needs of others. School runs, appointments, meal times. Today, the hours stretched before me, a blank page in my new notebook. I decided to simply walk. I left the tourist map on the bedside table. I wanted to get lost. The Alfama district was a labyrinth of steep, cobblestone streets, a place where the sun struggled to reach the ground. Laundry was strung from balcony to balcony like prayer flags. The air smelled of coffee and baking bread and something else, something old and faintly fishy, the scent of the nearby river. I walked slowly, letting my feet decide the way. I was not a tourist trying to see the sights. I was a man trying to feel a place. Old women in black dresses watched me from their doorways, their faces etched with the maps of their own long lives. Children kicked a football in a sun-drenched courtyard. I felt utterly anonymous, and it was a glorious feeling. I was not grandpa or dad. I was just a man with a silver watch and good leather shoes, walking through a city he had never seen before. I found a small cafe, a pastelaria, with a few round tables on the sidewalk. I ordered a coffee and a pastel de nata, the famous Portuguese custard tart. The coffee was strong and dark, served in a tiny cup. The tart was a revelation, its pastry crisp and flaky, its custard warm and sweet, with a blistered, caramelized top. It was a small, perfect thing, a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure that was entirely my own. I sat there for over an hour, watching the famous yellow tram, the number 28, rattle past, its bell clanging. It was packed with tourists, their faces pressed against the glass, cameras flashing. They were capturing the city. I felt as though I was being absorbed by it. In the afternoon, I found myself drawn towards a river, the Great Tagus Estuary. The light here was different, brighter, bouncing off the water and illuminating the city in a soft, golden haze. I stood by the water's edge, watching the ferries and fishing boats, and felt a profound sense of peace. I had done it. I had crossed an ocean. I had broken the unwritten rules of my life. I reached into my pocket and took out my wallet, removing the small, folded photograph I always carried. It was of Martha and me, taken on our honeymoon. We were so young. She was laughing, her head thrown back. I looked at the man I had been, full of a future I could not have imagined. I had loved her. I had built a life for her, for our son. But in the process, I had misplaced myself. I folded the photograph carefully and put it back. It was part of my story, but it was not the whole story. Perhaps, I thought, the final chapters were yet to be written. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I went to a record store. It was a small, dusty place, filled with the hallowed silence of old vinyl. I ran my fingers along the spines of the album covers, the cardboard worn smooth by 1,000 other hands. And then I saw it. Chet Baker Sings, an original pressing. The cover was a little faded, the corners soft, but it was there. The music of my youth, the soundtrack to a version of myself I had almost forgotten. The man behind the counter, an old man with a magnificent white beard, nodded in approval as I brought it to him. "Boa Escala," he said. "Good choice." We spoke for a few minutes in a broken mix of English and gestures, two old men sharing a silent understanding of the power of a trumpet and a sad, gentle voice. I bought the record, though I had no way to play it. It didn't matter. Owning it was enough. It was an artifact from my own archaeological dig. It was proof that the man who loved jazz still existed. He had just been buried for a while. I walked back to my hotel with the record under my arm like a shield. I felt my posture change. I was walking taller, less folded. For 3 days, I lived this new life. I explored, I ate, I sat in quiet squares and wrote in my notebook. I described the color of the tiles, the taste of the wine, the sound of the Portuguese language, which seemed to me a language of perpetual sighs. I was not lonely. Solitude and loneliness, I was discovering, were two very different things. Solitude was a choice, a space to be filled with one's own thoughts. Loneliness was the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people. I had been lonely for years in my own home. Here, I felt only a quiet sense of presence. On the fourth day, I was sitting in my usual cafe, sketching the intricate ironwork of a nearby balcony in my notebook, when a man at the next table spoke to me. "That's a very fine pen," he said, in a crisp British accent. I looked up. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with a lean, weathered face and intelligent blue eyes. He was dressed in a linen jacket, looking entirely at ease with himself. "Thank you," I said. "It was a gift." "A man who still uses a fountain pen is a man who respects the written word," he said, with a wry smile. "Or he's just old-fashioned." He gestured to the empty chair at my table. "May I? The sun is rather brutal over there." I nodded, and he moved to join me. "Arthur," he said, extending a hand. "Henry," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm. Arthur was a retired history professor from Cambridge. His wife had passed away a few years prior, and he now spent his time traveling, as he put it, following the footnotes of history. He was witty, erudite, and possessed a gentle, probing curiosity. He asked me what brought me to Lisbon, and for the first time, I told the story. I told him about the passports, about the canceled flight, about my quiet escape. I expected judgment, or perhaps pity. I received neither. He listened intently, his blue eyes never leaving my face. When I had finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he took a sip of his espresso. "Well," he said, setting the cup down with a soft click, "it seems to me your family made the classic, fatal error of mistaking a dormant volcano for an extinct one." The words hung in the air between us. A dormant volcano, not extinct. The metaphor was so perfect, so validating, that it felt as though he had reached into my chest and articulated a truth I hadn't yet dared to form myself. I felt a laugh escape me, a real, rusty sound I hadn't heard in years. "I suppose so," I said. "It seems to have rumbled a bit, more than a rumble, my dear Henry," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling. "That was a full-blown eruption. A quiet one, to be sure. The most dangerous kind. Good for you." His validation was a balm. It was not the coddling sympathy of my family, but the clear-eyed respect of a peer. He saw me not as a grandfather who had run away, but as a man who had claimed his own life. We talked for hours about history, about books, about the strange, disorienting experience of outliving the person you thought you'd spend your whole life with. For the first time, I was having a conversation with someone who wasn't my child or grandchild, someone who saw me simply as a contemporary, another man navigating the strange, uncharted territory of late life. The next day, Arthur suggested we take a train to Sintra to see the old palaces. I agreed without hesitation. We spent the day walking through the surreal, romantic gardens of the Quinta de Regalera, with its hidden tunnels and grottos. Arthur provided a running commentary on the architecture, the history, the symbolism. I simply absorbed the beauty of it all. As we stood at the top of the initiation well, looking down into its spiraling depths, he turned to me. "I'm heading to Seville next week," he said casually. "By train. They say the light there is the color of honey. You should come." The offer was spontaneous, simple, and my acceptance was just as swift. "All right," I said. The decision was that easy. There was no one to consult, no schedule to check. Just a man offering a suggestion and another man accepting it. It was a dizzying taste of a freedom I had never known. That evening, back at my hotel, my phone buzzed. I had kept it off for days, but had switched it on out of a vestigial sense of duty. A text message. It was from David. My heart gave a familiar lurch of anxiety. I opened it. The message read, "Hi, Dad. Hope you're okay. The cat's food is in the pantry to the left of the sink. Is there more in the garage?" I stared at the words on the screen. The cat's food. After 4 days of silence, this was their first contact. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "Where are you?" Not even an acknowledgement of their ruined holiday plans. Just a logistical query about pet food. The sheer, breathtaking obliviousness of it was almost comical. They weren't worried. They hadn't even noticed my absence in any meaningful way. I was a function, a caretaker. And when the function was not being performed, A simple text would suffice to correct the error. I looked at the message, at the mundane, self-absorbed words. Then I looked at the train ticket to Seville I had booked with Arthur an hour earlier. I typed a one-word reply to my son. No, then, with a feeling of immense satisfaction, I turned the phone off again and placed it in the bottom of my suitcase. The train journey from Lisbon to Seville was a slow, meditative transition from one world to another. We moved through a sun-scorched landscape of olive groves and cork trees, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a soothing counterpoint to my thoughts. Traveling with Arthur was easy. He was a man comfortable with silence, but his conversation, when it came, was always enriching. He pointed out Roman ruins from the window, told me the history of the Knights Templar in the region, and recommended a specific tapas bar in Seville that served, in his opinion, the finest jamon iberico in all of Andalusia. Seville was a furnace. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that drove everyone into the cool, shaded interiors of cafes and courtyards. The light, as Arthur had promised, was the color of honey, a thick, golden syrup that pooled in the narrow streets and made the whitewashed walls glow. We found a small hotel in the Santa Cruz Quarter, the old Jewish ghetto, a maze of alleys so narrow you could touch both walls at once. My room had a dark wood-beamed ceiling and a window that opened onto a tiny patio filled with the scent of jasmine. My days fell into a new rhythm, a world away from the predictable cadence of my life at home. Mornings were for exploring before the heat became unbearable. Afternoons were for reading in the shade of a courtyard, a cool drink sweating on the table beside me. Evenings were for tapas, for wandering from one small, noisy bar to another, sharing plates of olives, cheese, and thinly sliced ham that melted on the tongue. I felt a physical change in myself. The stoop in my shoulders, the one that came from years of bending down to children and hunching over garden beds, was gone. Arthur commented on it one evening as we sat watching flamenco dancers in a small, crowded bar. "You know, Henry," he said, raising his voice over the passionate strumming of the guitar, "when I first met you, you looked like a man apologizing for taking up space. You don't look like that anymore." His observation struck me as profoundly true. I had spent so long trying to be unobtrusive, to shrink myself to fit the small space my family had allotted me, that I had forgotten how to simply stand. Here, in this city of proud, passionate people, I was learning to occupy my own skin again. I was learning that my presence was not an imposition. After a week in Seville, my phone had become a dead weight in the bottom of my bag. But one afternoon, driven by a flicker of that old, ingrained sense of obligation, I switched it on. It sprang to life with a cascade of notifications. A dozen missed calls from David. Several from Sarah. A string of text messages. I scrolled through them, a strange sense of detachment settling over me. The tone shifted from confusion to irritation, and finally, to outright accusation. "Dad, where are you?" "We're worried." That was the first one. It was followed quickly by, "Your phone is off. Please turn it on," then the shift. "Sarah is very upset. You can't just disappear." This is incredibly selfish. And the final one, from David, sent just that morning. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not funny. You have responsibilities. We're your family. Call me." Now, I read the messages and I felt nothing. The words were meant to trigger guilt, to pull me back into the familiar orbit of their needs. But they were like arrows shot from too great a distance, falling harmlessly at my feet. Selfish. The word bounced around in my mind. Was it selfish to want to exist? Was it selfish to claim a small piece of my own life before it was over? The man who sat reading those texts in a sun-drenched Spanish courtyard was not the same man who had nodded obediently in a kitchen in England. The distance between us was far greater than the miles I had traveled. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation. I only felt a deep, quiet resolve. This was my life now. I switched the phone off again. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound in the world. From Seville, we went to Córdoba and then to Granada. Each city was a new verse in the poem of my rediscovery. In Córdoba, I was mesmerized by the Mezquita, the great mosque cathedral, with its forest of red and white striped arches. I could have spent days in there, lost in the interplay of light and shadow, a physical manifestation of the complex layers of history, of identities built one on top of the other. It felt like a metaphor for my own life. In Granada, we visited the Alhambra, and I stood in the Court of the Lions, listening to the gentle murmur of the fountains, a sound designed for contemplation and peace. I was filling my senses with new sights, new sounds, new tastes. I was overriding the old, faded data of my previous life with vibrant, high-definition memories. My notebook was filling up. I wrote about the taste of fresh orange juice from a street vendor in Seville. I wrote about the sound of the flamenco singer's voice, a raw, guttural cry of pain and joy that bypassed the brain and went straight to the heart. I wrote about Arthur's dry wit and the comfort of his easy companionship. I was not just recording my journey. I was recording the rebirth of my own consciousness, the return of a man who noticed the world and had something to say about it. One evening in Granada, Arthur came down with a sudden fever. He was shivering despite the evening heat, his face pale. I felt a familiar instinct rise in me, the caretaker. But this time it was different. It was not a duty, it was a choice. I helped him to his room, got him into bed, and went out to find a pharmacy. I navigated the foreign streets, used my rudimentary Spanish to buy fever reducers and a thermometer. I brought him cool water and sat with him, placing a damp cloth on his forehead. I was performing the same actions I had performed for my wife, for my son, for my grandchildren. But the context was entirely new. This was not the fulfillment of a prescribed role. It was an act of friendship, of chosen connection. I was not Grandpa Henry, the designated worrier. I was Henry, a man looking after his friend. It was a simple distinction, but it changed everything. By the next morning, Arthur's fever had broken, and he was weak, but recovering. "You're a good man in a crisis, Henry," he said, his voice hoarse. I just smiled. "I've had some practice," I replied. A few days later, a letter arrived for me at the hotel's front desk. It had been forwarded from the hotel in Lisbon. It was from Sarah. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, the old reflex kicking in. Her handwriting was a neat, controlled script. The letter was 4 pages long. It spoke of her confusion, her hurt. It detailed how much they had been looking forward to the trip, how disappointed the children were. It talked about the money they had lost, the plans that had been ruined. It was a long and detailed account of their suffering. And in all 4 pages, there was not a single sentence that expressed curiosity or concern for my own state of mind. There was no question of why I might have done what I did. The entire letter was a mirror, reflecting only her own bewildered and aggrieved face. It ended with a plea. "Please, just come home. We could talk about this. We just want everything to go back to normal, back to normal." The words chilled me. Normal was the quiet invisibility. Normal was the passport left by the key bowl. Normal was being the foundation that no one ever looked at. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. There was nothing to say in response. We were speaking different languages. She was speaking the language of status quo, of familial roles. I was just beginning to learn the language of the self. That same afternoon, a message appeared on the screen of my laptop. I had logged in my email to book our next train ticket, and there it was. A message from Lily, my granddaughter. My heart beat a little faster. Her message was short, just a few lines. "Grandpa, I think I know why you left. I saw your face that morning. I'm not mad. I hope you're having a wonderful adventure. I hope you're finding whatever it is you want to look for. Love, Lily." I read the message once, twice, a third time, and then for the first time since this journey began, I felt tears well in my eyes. Not tears of grief, but of a startling, overwhelming gratitude. She saw me. This young girl, with her quiet, perceptive eyes, had seen past the role of grandpa and had seen the man underneath. She had not judged or demanded. She had understood. Her message was a bridge, a slender, luminous connection across the chasm of misunderstanding that separated me from the rest of my family. It was a gift of such profound empathy that it took my breath away. Her validation was worth more than 1,000 letters like Sarah's. It was the blessing I hadn't known I was seeking. It was a sign that perhaps the future was not as barren as I had thought. One person understood. That was enough. That night, I knew what I had to do. The anger was gone. The hurt had receded. All that was left was a calm, unshakable clarity. I took out my phone. I didn't want to talk to them, to get drawn into a vortex of accusation and defense. A voicemail was better. It was a statement, not a negotiation. I called David's number. It went to his mailbox, as I knew it would. After the beep, I began to speak, my voice low and steady, the voice of the new man I had become. "David," I began, "this message is for you and for Sarah. I am safe. I am well. I am not coming home yet. I need you to understand something. The man who lived in your house, the man who watched the cat and watered the ferns, is no longer available. I have retired from that position. For years, I have made myself small to make your lives bigger, and I am done doing that. I am not a utility. I'm not a background character in your story. From now on, I will be the protagonist in my own. When I do return, it will be on new terms. Terms we will discuss. Until then, I wish you well. But my life is now my own." I ended the call. My hand was perfectly steady. There was no anger in my voice, no self-pity. Just the simple, unadorned truth. It was my manifesto, my declaration of a new constitution. I had laid down the law of my own land. A feeling of profound lightness washed over me, as if I had set down a heavy bag I had been carrying my entire life. I walked back into my hotel room. I saw the record I had bought in Lisbon, Chet Baker Sings, leaning against the wall. On a whim, I went to the front desk. The young man there had a small, portable record player he used for his own collection. He was happy to lend it to me. Back in my room, I placed the record on the turntable. I cleaned the vinyl with the edge of my shirt, a ritual I hadn't performed in decades. I lowered the needle. A soft crackle, and then that voice, that trumpet, a sound like bruised silk, full of a heartbreaking, gentle melancholy. The music filled the small room. It filled me. It was the sound of my own rediscovered soul. I turned the volume up loud. I stood in the middle of the room, closed my eyes, and just listened. It was an act of pure, uninhibited joy. A celebration. The dormant volcano was at last singing its own song. A few weeks later, as Arthur and I were sitting in a cafe in Florence, having made our way through the south of France and into Italy, a message arrived. Not on my phone, which remained a silent brick, but forwarded to my email from Lily, who had somehow become my willing co-conspirator and communications officer. It was a scanned, handwritten letter from my daughter-in-law, Sarah. I opened the attachment with a sense of weary resignation, expecting another litany of complaints. But the first sentence stopped me cold. "Dear Henry," it began, "I'm so sorry." I read on, my skepticism slowly melting away. The tone was entirely different from her previous letter. There was no defensiveness, no blame. She wrote about the voicemail I had left. She said they had listened to it a dozen times. At first, they had been angry, but then, she wrote, something had shifted. She described a conversation she'd had with David, a real, difficult conversation. She wrote about how they had started to see things from my perspective, how they had taken my quiet presence for granted, how they had unconsciously demoted me from a person to a function. "You were right," she wrote. "We saw you as a background character. We never stopped to think that you had your own story still going on. We saw your age, but we didn't see you. For that, I am truly, deeply sorry. It was the apology I had never expected to receive. It was direct, it took responsibility, and it demonstrated genuine self-awareness. It was not a magic wand. It did not erase years of quiet neglect. But it was a beginning. It was a seed." Arthur, who had been watching my face as I read, raised an eyebrow. "Good news or bad?" he asked. I looked up from the screen, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "But it's definitely news. I stayed in Europe for another month." Arthur and I parted ways in Rome, with a firm handshake and a promise to meet again somewhere in the world. He was heading to Greece. I felt a pull, for the first time, towards home. Not the home I had left, but a home I might be able to create. I was not returning because they had summoned me. I was returning because I was ready. My journey had not been about escaping my family, but about finding myself. Now that I could face them, not as a dependent, but as an equal. The flight back was the reverse of the one I had taken months before. I was flying into the sunset, not away from it. When I walked through the arrivals gate, I saw Lily standing there, waiting for me. She was alone. She ran to me and gave me a hug that was fierce and strong. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes scanning my face. "You look different, Grandpa," she said. "Taller," I laughed. "I feel taller, Lily." She drove me home. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw the roses were overgrown, in need of pruning. The lawn was a little too long, but the house itself looked the same. Solid, familiar. But I was different. As I walked through the front door, the house felt smaller than I remembered it. Or perhaps I had simply become bigger. David and Sarah were in the living room. They stood up when I entered. The air was thick with an awkward, fragile tension. There was no shouting, no recriminations. Just a profound, uncertain silence. David looked older than I remembered, more careworn. Sarah's face was open, her expression stripped of its usual defensiveness. She looked, for the first time, vulnerable. It was David who spoke first. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet. "Welcome home," I nodded. "It's good to be back." It was not the triumphant return of a prodigal father. It was something quieter, more complex. It was the first tentative meeting of ambassadors from two different countries, trying to establish diplomatic relations. We did not talk about my trip that day. We did not talk about the canceled flight or the voicemail. We talked about small things. The weather, the garden, Lily's upcoming exams. We were circling each other, learning the shape of this new dynamic. I was no longer just an observer in their conversations. I asked questions. I offered opinions. I took up space. And they, to my surprise, made room for me. The real change was solidified a few days later. Lily came to me in the garden as I was pruning the roses. She had a travel brochure in her hand. "Grandpa," she said, her expression serious. "I've been thinking. For my gap year before university, I want to go to Vietnam and Cambodia. I was wondering if you'd come with me." She looked at me, her eyes full of hope. "I could use a good traveling companion," she added, with a small smile. My heart swelled. This was the true gift of my journey. Not the sights I had seen or the cities I had visited. It was this connection, this proof that my transformation had not just been for me, but had created a new possibility for the people I loved. I had modeled a new way of being, and she had seen it. She had understood it, and she wanted to be a part of it. "Lily," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I would be honored. My journey had not ended when I stepped off the plane. It was just beginning. And this time, I would not be traveling alone. Not out of obligation, but out of a joyful, chosen partnership. That night, I sat down at my old oak desk. I took out the leather-bound notebook I had carried with me across Europe. It was nearly full, its pages crammed with my handwriting, with sketches, with ticket stubs and wine labels. I turned to the last blank page. I uncapped my fountain pen, the one Arthur had admired. The ink flowed, dark and permanent. I wanted to codify what I had learned, to write down the final lesson of my great escape. I thought for a moment, and then I began to write. "A man's life is his own," I wrote. "It is not a service to be rendered to others. It is a story to be written." For many years, I allowed others to hold the pen. I was a character in their narrative, a minor one with few lines. I have learned that the pen was always in my own hand. I simply had to remember how to use it. The final chapters may be the shortest, but they can, if one is brave enough, be the most interesting. It is never too late to begin a new paragraph. It is never too late to change the story. My story is not over. I am the one who writes the end. I closed the book. The house was quiet. My watch ticked softly on my wrist, marking my time. And I was at last ready for whatever came next.